let's discuss a little bit staying in the SEC West. Joe Moorhead comes over from Penn State to Mississippi State, who lost Dan Mullen to Florida after a good year, it's interesting because a lot of these teams that don't get consistent success are often replacing a guy who didn't get it done where he was at. And it's sort of like you step into something that is almost easy because you can just fix a lot of things that were wrong and get some of the low-hanging fruit, easy wins kind of thing. But this time it's not the case at Mississippi State. You're coming in behind a guy who won a lot of games there, won 9 games last year. 9-4 at Mississippi State is a good season. Leaves for Florida, but leaves a good bit of talent behind. So give me a little bit on, before we get into Moorhead in particular, and what he's going to bring and change at Mississippi State, talk a little bit about what it's like coming into a situation like this where you're replacing a guy that did really well at a school that traditionally doesn't do that well.
It's interesting because, and it does happen somewhat, but I think it's unusual to have a guy that stuck around as long as Mullen did and actually really built something and then leave. Normally, when we see this happen, teams spike and they lose the guy and they kind of fall off. But you don't normally see that where Mullen's been around for, however many seasons now. It was like 8, 10 seasons he was there. And when you do that, you change everything about the culture, not just the culture, but also the administration, the organization. Literal physical facilities are changed. They upgraded the stadium. They built a jumbotron. They built a new football facility. He's going to have input on the way the meetings are set up. He's going to have input on the way all the football facility infrastructure is organized, how the administration handles football. He will have created tutoring facilities for the football players. He's going to create a regime to manage medical issues for the football players, and all that stuff really matters. And all the great coaches are really incredibly detail oriented in all those issues. There's certain coaches in the SEC that I'm critical of because I don't think they are. But when you talk about the great ones like Mullen, they do stuff like that. And if they're around for a long time, it can leave a really, really positive legacy. And as I mentioned earlier, there's guys I'm critical of. I'm critical of Orgeron. I was fairly critical of Miles at LSU, but people talk about how Les Miles inherited Nick Saban's players. I think while that may be true, I think the really, really underrated part of it is Les Miles inherited Nick Saban's LSU football administrative structure. And all that stuff, all that massive machinery that goes on, and there's all these directors of player personnel and assistant director of player personnel and recruiting director, and you have all these positions. Even if you replace those guys, at least all these roles have been created, and your AD and the assistant AD kind of know what's going on, and that leaves a really, really big impact. So, specifically with Mississippi State, when you're bringing in Moorhead, a guy that has very limited experience at the FBS level, I think it's going to be extremely beneficial to Mississippi State that Mullen left them a lot of infrastructure, and Moorhead's going to walk into a situation where he's going to have to pick guys to fill chairs, but he doesn't have to rethink the way a football team should be organized. And when you lose a guy that's really bad in a football program, right? When Ole Miss lost Ed Orgeron, it takes a long time to recover, and it can be really difficult, in particular because what you end up a lot of times having is a massive vacuum, and it's chaos. And the new coach that comes in has to rethink everything about the football program, and he has to sit down and spend weeks coming up with what all the administrative positions should be. And he's going to fire a bunch of guys in the AD or have them fired, and he's going to hire a whole bunch of guys and push the administration to hire new assistant athletic directors, and it goes on and on and on. And that's a whole world that Moorhead doesn't have to deal with because of what Mullen's already left in place at Mississippi State.
I think it's interesting because if you look at if you look at Penn State's success last year and really the last 2 years, a lot of people, I think it was today that an article came out on CBS where it was an anonymous coach thing, which, by the way, all of these anonymous coach stories are complete BS. They're not anonymous coaches. I do not believe it. You cannot convince me of it. A lot of their observations are really fan-like, and they lack detail or the type of intelligence of the game that someone who spends their days eating and breathing this stuff all day long would observe. Anyway, we'll talk about that another day. They came up with this story with anonymous coaches. It was said that Franklin at Penn State was one of the most overrated head coaches in college football. And you were actually critical of James Franklin when he was at Vanderbilt. And you didn't think it was a great move to Penn State, if I remember correctly. And we've been critical of not only the fact that in the Big Ten, when they've gone to the 9-game schedule, they've got some baked in wins when you add a Rutgers and a Maryland, and you can avoid maybe a Wisconsin or an Ohio State or something like that. Penn State has also had 3 terrible OOC games every season. Last season they went Akron, Pitt, Georgia State to start the season. So 10 wins almost guaranteed for Penn State. What I did find interesting, and what you don't even see at Ohio State, you don't see it at Michigan State, you definitely don't see it at Wisconsin, they didn't roll out any offensive clunkers last year. And say what you want about Franklin or anything else, if you want to look at something that was a positive for Moorhead coming into Mississippi State, his offense was clicking. They did have a 21-point game against Iowa, but that was a good defense. We saw, I think, 4 or 5 turnovers against Ohio State when they killed them. He didn't roll out any clunkers on offense. And everybody's going to say, yeah, you got a top draft pick running back. It's really, really, really good. But what he's done with McSorley up there, I think is pretty special, because Trace McSorley is not a prototype quarterback. And I actually think in a lot of ways he's going to have a lot more to work with Fitzgerald, although a far different type of quarterback. That's encouraging to me if I'm a Mississippi State fan. Talk about the fact that, and I think we've got a perfect example of this in the SEC, and I don't want to compare Vanderbilt to Mississippi State because I don't think it's fair given Mississippi State's history and some of the success they've had in the past. But it is interesting for the teams that know they can't recruit at the highest level, the philosophy behind, do you go defensive guy and try to win the 9-6 games against the teams that are better than you and more talented than you? Or do you roll with the offensive guy and hope to light up the scoreboard? Do you think that there's some strategy there with going with an offensive guy after seeing what happened is happening at Vanderbilt, for a team that might not have the best recruits on their team to sort of bridge that gap or neutralize the difference? Or do you think they went with an offensive guy because they've already got a quarterback in Fitzgerald, they've already got a sort of a history with Mullen with quarterbacks and offenses at Mississippi State, and they want to sort of continue that, and that's the fans' expectation or what they found that works best? I guess talk a little bit, there's a lot of questions there, but maybe compare it to Vanderbilt and talk about why you think they went with an offensive-minded guy and not a defensive-minded guy.
We've talked about this a lot the past few seasons, that one of the ways you can try to climb your way up in college football is to increase the volatility of the game. And when I say that, I mean college football as a sport has really high variance. And we do statistical models, as you noted, and we can't do those until we're maybe 4 games into the season at a bare minimum, just because right now there's not enough data to make any sort of reasonable prediction. I'm looking at you, FBI, but because of the issue that a turnover can turn into a touchdown, right? One fumbled punt in a game can mean a 14-point swing, where one team that would have a drive that normally score can, he drops a ball and a guy picks it up and they hit a bomb, boom, 14 points. There are a lot of things you can do to sort of take advantage of that. Now, the more you try to push the ball downfield offensively, the more you get aggressive offensively, usually the more volatile your result is. The more you push defensive football, in particular, shortening the game and, playing the, 9 yards in a cloud and at dust. But a lot of that actually has to do with your offensive philosophy being more conservative. The more volatility tends to go down. And the reason for that is, when you take lots and lots of deep shots, it results in a lot of touchdowns. It results in a lot of interceptions. If you hit the plays, you get more touchdowns, you get more points, you win. If you miss the plays, you throw more interceptions. Another big example for a while was Oregon going for 2-point conversions. they went for 2-point conversions because they did all the math and they said, look, if you're going to score more points on average if you go for two than if you don't go for two, and by a significant margin, because more often than not you get the 2-point conversion. I've always been a fairly critical, maybe outspoken critic of that, and the reason is, look, that's great that you score more points on average, but the thing you're missing is extra points are guaranteed. It's stable. And when you start trying to go for two, and there's an example, I forget, a few years ago when Stanford beat Oregon. Oregon missed, I think, 3 2-point conversions in that game that really crippled them. And the problem is, when you do all these, take all these risks, things can go against you. Now, why do I have this whole conversation? Because if you're at a disadvantage in terms of talent, if you're stable and you get the stable, predictable result, you lose because the other team is better than you in terms of talent. And I think this is probably where you were going with the comparison with Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt is not as talented as the teams they play. And they brought in a guy in Derek Mason that's a very, tough, hard-nosed coach, defensive-minded. But what they inadvertently did when they did that, when they went, hardcore defense, is they reverted back to the way they had been. And I think when Johnson was the coach, people like to talk about how hard it was when you played Vanderbilt, but Vanderbilt very rarely won under Johnson. James Franklin in some ways was a worse team, but he was really aggressive, and they won some games they might not have otherwise won because of it. I think the biggest example in the SEC has been Ole Miss. Ole Miss adopted a style of offense that pushed the ball vertically down the field almost without abandon. That's how they beat Alabama. Because Ole Miss, if they played, player for player and they played straight up football, they ain't going to beat Alabama because they don't have the talent that Alabama does. Now, you have to understand the flip side of this equation. When you do this, you have games that are absolute clunkers. And, if you look back in 2015, Ole Miss beats Alabama because they have all this aggressive stuff. They have crazy plays where ball bounces off a defensive back's hands and into a receiver, and he runs down the field for a touchdown. And then they get in another game with Arkansas, right, where they were a lot better than Arkansas was. A lot of things went against him in that game. Arkansas hit some shots. All of a sudden, there's a crazy play, and Ole Miss loses. So, it is a problem if you want to win a national title with that style offense. It's going to cost you a chance at a conference championship from time to time because of all the aggressiveness. But if you're not a team that isn't normally in that position, if you're a team that can't play straight up and get into the conference championship discussion, then it's, by all means, you adopt an aggressive style of offense. Out of 5 years, maybe 2 of the 5 years it burns you in a key game. 2 out of the 5 years, it all comes out a wash. And that 1 in 5 chance of beating Alabama or Auburn, the games you have to win to make a conference discussion, lets you have a shot at the conference title that maybe you wouldn't have if you played more to your recruiting level and kept things closer to the vest. And then you end up more like Vanderbilt the past few years.
All right, so I don't want to spoil sort of our preview of Miss State or our selection of where we think they're going to fall in the SEC West this season, but I do want to discuss kind of where you see him being able to pick up where Dan Mullen left off. So they went 9-4 last year, had a couple of really bad losses early in the season, had a big win against LSU, and had a pretty good win, I think, against Louisville in the bowl game. Not a great team that they faced, but they were also they were down Fitzgerald in that bowl game and still came away with a win and still put up 31 points, which I think is a big deal. So without tipping your hand on where you think they're going to finish, just talk about how you think he's going to do. And we don't know how he's going to do as a head coach at the FBS level. But based on what you know about him and based on what you know about the outgoing coach in Dan Mullen, which you're very familiar with, tell me in your gut, how do you think he's going to do at Mississippi State?
I think he's probably going to be very successful out of the gate, honestly. I think, and it is interesting because there have been a lot of comments nationally from those anonymous coaches on Franklin not being impressed with him. I think what he did at Penn State in their offense has been pretty spectacular. Like you said, I'm not sure McSorley is a prototypical guy, but he realized McSorley threw really good deep balls and he had a lot of moxie. And he said, we're just going to be as aggressive as possible, throw a lot of shots and see if they can stop us. And he had a tremendous amount of success with that. So I think he's going to come in. He's going to do the same thing. I'm a little like you said, I'm really, really curious. And I know he says he's going to adapt his offense, but that is way more easily said than done. It's going to be tough for him to be as aggressive with the passing game as he is like to have been with Nick Fitzgerald. And in particular, I think you can't underestimate the fact that Mullen was extremely good at running his style of offense, and Fitzgerald was a perfect fit for that Tim Tebow bash your head in and then throw over the top kind of guy that Mullen liked. I also think it's pretty concerning that really Mississippi State's receivers, we talked about this a lot last year, they're really talented guys, but they're not prototypical receivers. They're all kind of odd. If they're, huge, or some of them, Mixon is tiny. Um, when you've got guys that are so like weird like that, it kind of makes it hard to run your offense. So I think there's going to be some adjustments. And because of that, I don't know. I'd be curious to see how they do this year. I think it could be anywhere on the map. I could see them having some really kind of unexpected growing pains, but I also see them, in the next few years, maybe with Caton Thompson, that I think has a tremendous amount of potential, becoming a pretty good team and more competent in the passing game. The real questions are going to all come into the play of how well does Moorhead run an FBS program? Can he recruit in an FBS level effectively? I'm not going to give a judgment one way or the other because, we do this a lot on the show. I think anything you do, you have to be aware of when something would be a hot take, right? And I think saying Moorhead would be successful or a failure there would be a hot take. We don't know. And you have to acknowledge the fact that we don't know that and just treat it as an unknown. And that's going to be the thing that really decides their success the next few
I was
years.
hoping that for 2018 we had lost the phrase hot take. A lot of people hate the phrase pick six. Hot take is mine. It's my hate, the thing I just hate. Interesting because you have had some really good insights on Jake Bentley at South Carolina. So what does it say, just real quick, to you that, because it's funny that you mentioned what you mentioned about McSorley, about what he recognized in him. I feel like they recognized the same exact quarterback in Bentley at South Carolina, and Moorhead was a lot more successful at Penn State. Now, there's a couple of personnel issues and probably strength of schedule issues at play, but is that a fair comparison and fair to say that he did a lot better with his hand that he was dealt at quarterback than South Carolina has done with theirs?
I think it is. And it's hard to say why, but I think a lot of it is honestly, it's been a willingness to just be aggressive for aggressiveness sake. I mean, South Carolina takes a lot of shots. I get that. And they realize that Bentley is a boomer bust guy, but I don't feel like South Carolina really built their offense around that, right? Around the idea that we need to throw, we need to throw 10 to 15 balls over 40 yards over the course of the game. And Penn State did that. They said, we need to throw 15 deep passes a game. And a lot of that was to take advantage of the strengths McSorley had. And they knew they would hit some of them. They wouldn't hit some of them. But, if you hit just three or four of those passes, it's 20 to 30 points in a game. It's a huge impact. And they really feasted on that. So I do think it says a lot about Moorhead. And I'm going to be really curious to see how it shakes out because as much as we said McSorley may not be prototypical, he was really, really darn good at throwing the deep ball. And they had some good receivers. And as we've said, for the past couple of years, we've kind of really been skeptical of the quality of teams they've been playing in the Big Ten. Particularly, there's some signs the past couple of years that the secondaries weren't great. They just weren't playing teams that could throw the football. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see how well it translates. And probably more importantly, I don't think Fitzgerald is anywhere near consistent enough or accurate enough throwing the football down the field to run the same kind of offense. So is this something where Moorhead is really good at dealing with a kid like McSorley? And did you pick a guy because he was good at running an offense that you're not going to be able to run? Or is Moorhead really that adaptable? Is he going to be able to run something with Fitzgerald that's going to look extremely different than what you would need to do with a Bentley or a McSorley? And I think it's going to be kind of an interesting / almost fascinating thing to watch as the season develops.